Welcome to the Quick Start Guide for Lumenzia. This video is meant to give you a high-level overview of how Lumenzia operates so that you can jump right in and start to enjoy Lumenzia. In the subsequent videos, we'll go into much greater depth around specific functions within Lumenzia, but I want to start by just giving you the big picture of how it operates and allow you the opportunity to go ahead and start using it right away with just a quick bit of instruction. So Lumenzia is organized around three core functions. The first is to preview luminosity masks to allow you to see what you're going to adjust and quickly and easily select the appropriate luminosity mask. The second is to apply that preview either as a selection or as a layer mask on a layer so that you can have an effect on your image. And third, because luminosity masks are often fairly general, we need a set of tools to refine the luminosity mask and isolate it to specific parts of the image, typically a particular area of the image or perhaps a particular color. So again, that was to preview, apply, and refine luminosity masks. Those are the core functions of Lumenzia. The preview buttons actually take up most of the panel. Everything you see surrounded here with the orange dotted line, these are all various preview tools. There are all the standard luminosity masks in the top block here, starting from darks down through zone 10. These are all essentially kind of typical luminosity masks that you can simply click on any of them. For example, a lights 2, and this will show you what a lights 2 mask would look like before you use it. We also have vibrance and saturation masks, which we won't cover here, as well as these custom zone and range pickers that allow you to interactively select parts of the image, and those again will be covered in later tutorials. With the previews here, when you click on any of these, you can quickly cycle through various different options. We can see here moving down the lights, which are highlights in the image. As we move down, we're getting progressively more selective to just the brightest parts of the image. With a light 6 mask, which we know is a light 6 because we clicked on L6, and because we see L6 in the orange preview layers here, we are selecting the brightest parts of the sky and the artificial lights in the image, which are the brightest parts of the image. Now we can see this preview because of these temporary orange layers that are created by Lumenzia. These are not meant to be a permanent part of your image, and that's why they're colored orange. They are simply meant to generate a preview so you can see what the mask will look like before you use it. They have a secondary function, which is that you can customize the mask by working on any of these three layers. I'm not going to cover that here. Just know that even with all these different defaults here, you can take things a step further by simply clicking into these various options and then beginning to tweak them so you can get a mask that selects exactly what you want. Now with these previews, if you ever want to see the underlying image to help understand what you're selecting specifically, you can simply hide them by clicking on the topmost group mask layer here, clicking on the eyeball, and that turns off the preview. It hides the preview so you can see the original underlying image. So we can see, for example, we know the darkest areas might be including these railings and the trees, and in fact when we go and turn back on the preview and then click on something like a darks 3 mask, that's exactly what we see. The darker areas are most selected. Down to darks 5 you really begin to see that principle at work. So you can turn your preview on and off if you ever need to see the underlying image. And if you ever wanted to just simply get rid of the preview because you didn't need to use it, you can click the X button and that will quickly and easily remove those layers for you so you can go back to the image without making any changes to the image. So let's go ahead and find a mask that's going to help us with this sky. In this image, I think the sky looks fairly blown out on the right. I'd like to darken it down a bit, so I need to find an appropriate lights mask that will help me select the blue sky. Ideally, I'd find something that's selective to the sky, but it looks like we're going to have some problems with the building here and we'll have to correct that later. So first, let's just find the mask we want. If I look at lights 3, I have a pretty good selection of the sky, and it does taper off in the areas where I want the transition to really stop. So this looks pretty good. If I look at lights 4, it looks a little bit too selective to me. I still want to adjust these parts of the sky, so I'm going to go back and use lights 3. So now that we've used preview to find the mask we want, we have to apply it. The next set of buttons in the middle of Lumenzia are all about applying the preview to a layer, mask, or selection. We have the cell button, which will create a selection if we click on it. In fact, I'll click on it now and we'll see that we have marching ants, and those preview areas have been turned into a selection. I'm going to undo that, go back a step here. So now we're looking at our preview once again. With the additional buttons here, all the rest of these buttons will create a layer mask. Clicking on curves, HSL, solid, or balance for color balance, all of these are going to create an adjustment layer. Clicking on mask is simply going to apply a mask to an existing layer. These next row, dodge, burn, vignette, and sharpen, are Lumenzia functions that will receive the mask you use. So for example, you could apply a vignette that has a luminosity mask applied to it to control that vignette. And we can also apply it in a group, and we'll get to this in just a minute. So the option I want to use here is going to be a curve because I want to darken this sky. So by clicking on curve, I've taken this preview and turned it into a layer mask on a new curve layer. And if I alt click on any luminosity mask, or any mask in Photoshop for that matter, we'll see a preview of this mask. So we're looking at this right here, and we can see the brackets around it telling us that this is active. This is the preview we had just a second ago. In fact, if we go back to where we had this, we can see when the orange preview layers are here, it's exactly what we had in the applied mask here. So we have turned that preview into this luminosity mask. And I can begin to make adjustments by simply double clicking to open up the properties on this curve. And we can see by default, Lumenzia has not made any curve adjustment, so there's no effect to this layer yet, because even though it has a mask on it, the layer itself is not doing anything. So it doesn't matter what the mask is because nothing is happening in the curve. So I want to darken these areas in the sky. Let's simply grab some of the brighter points and bring them down, and we can see that, yes, in fact, the sky is improving quite a bit. Here's before and here's after. Now, of course, we're also making changes to the building because when we look at our luminosity mask, the building was heavily selected. So it's not giving us just an adjustment in the sky. We're going to need to further refine this to get the selection we want. So we already have the sky we want. Now we need to protect the building and knock that out. And I'll show you a few different ways you could approach this. To refine this mask, I could simply start to paint on it with black paint. So if I hit the B key to get my paintbrush tool with this layer mask selected, I can simply begin to start painting on it. We can see these areas down below start getting a little bit lighter. If I Command Z to look kind of before and after, we can see that we block these out. And that was pretty easy to do with a brush because these are isolated. So I've gone back a step. Now we're looking at this layer mask, and as I paint over them again, we can see I don't have to be very precise because there's really a huge black gap between these areas. So as long as I don't just really mess up, I can pretty quickly knock these out. But it's a totally different story for this building because it butts right up to the sky. And I'll click this again so we can go back looking at the image. If I try and use a paintbrush here, as I start to brush on the building, it's going to be very hard to get a good selection. Now, I could spend a lot of time and try to make that perfect, but it's going to be one, a waste of time, and two, because we're painting directly on this underlying luminosity mask, we're making destructive changes. So any mistake we make is very hard to undo. So I'm going to actually just undo this, and undoing one, of course, is very easy, but coming back later is not so easy. So if we want to adjust this, what's another way we can do it without having to use a destructive paintbrush? It turns out you can apply a group mask to this. In other words, put a mask on a mask to further restrict what's going on. And the way you do that in Lumenzia is simply to click on group. And this is part of the next row of options here, from group through restore. These are all options to refine an existing luminosity mask. So by hitting group, I'm getting a new group, and the previously selected curve has been put into that group with a layer mask. Now, because this layer mask is white, nothing's occurring. But when we start to make adjustments on this mask will then be applied to any layers inside of it. And so for this layer, because it has a parent mask and a mask on this layer, the combination of these two masks will determine what actually comes through on this curve. So rather than painting on the building as we did before, that is, rather than painting on the luminosity mask building here, I'm going to instead paint on this mask on top. I'm going to alt click again so we can see the image live. As I paint on this, we can see it's having the same effect. I'm knocking out those changes, but they're occurring on this white mask instead of on the actual luminosity mask we created. Now I still have the same problem that I was very imprecise, but the advantage on being on the separate layer is if I simply swap my brush to white paint, now I can paint it back. So because I've put this on a separate layer, making any sort of correction or any sort of additional change to it with my paintbrush is very, very easy to do. So that is the benefit of working on a separate group mask, is that it keeps intact all the intricacies of this mask and allows you to keep refining on the separate layer. But of course, we're seeing that in this case, simply painting with a brush is not going to work very well. We need another tool. And to get to that right tool, I'm going to take this back a couple steps, and we're going to use a different approach. So I'm going back to just before we applied that group mask. So here we have again our curve, adjusting the sky and all these other parts. The next option to refine a mask here is the color group mask. And when I click on this, it uses a similar principle as before in that it creates a new group, but instead of just creating a blank mask, we're going to create a mask interactively using the color range tool. And it looks a little odd at first, but when you click on the image, you're going to see it's making a selection based on the color in the image, as well as proximity to where you click. So the fuzziness is how close to the color that I click on do you need to be. As I make the fuzziness lower, it's really picking just this particular shade of blue, or if I click here, this shade of blue, or this shade of blue. And as I increase the fuzziness, it's being a little bit more generous, just kind of like increasing the tolerance on the magic wand. Additionally, we have the range function, which is applying a secondary condition, which is saying how close to my starting point do I need to be. So if the identical blue is here and in some remote part of the image, adjusting the range will help me determine whether or not I want to have both blues selected or just really the one I click on. So as I bring the range down, we're going to see that it further isolates things pretty tightly. In fact, if we go and make a pretty low fuzziness adjustment here where it's really picking a particular band of blue, I've clicked in the middle here, as I bring this range down, we can see it's really going back to my starting point. So this is going to give you a lot of control to pick what you need to pick in terms of a color. So if I go and click over here in this part of the sky, I've got a pretty good selection of the sky. I don't quite yet have these areas, I need to add them. So let's see if we can get there by just simply increasing our fuzziness. I don't want to go too far because I'll run into the same problem if I'm selecting the building. So let's bring that down. And what we can do instead of trying to just change these two sliders is we can increase our selection. And you can do that by either holding the Shift key, which you see a plus next to my eyedropper now, or by just clicking on the plus version of the eyedropper, which will lock this in. And now as I click on additional parts here, we're going to see that it is adding to the selection rather than simply changing the selection. So if I'm going to go back here to the original tool, if I click on something, it just uses whatever I click on at that point. But when I hold down Shift or use this version of it, as I click in other places, it's going to expand the selection. It's going to consider additional similar areas. Likewise, I can use the minus tool, or by holding the Alt or Option key, I can knock out particular areas. So if I want to get rid of this building, I can Option click that. And now what I have is something that's pretty darn restrictive to the sky. There's really good separation between the sky and most of the building here. I could try and click on a few areas to knock that out further, and perhaps that's made it even better. I think this is pretty good. Let's go ahead and use this. So if I click OK, what we just saw there is now applied as a group mask. So just like before when we painted by hand, this mask is going to restrict this mask, but instead of painting by hand, we've created it based on color. If I Alt click it, we'll see it's what we had selected before, but now it's restricting to this layer below. So it has to be a combination. To get the curves adjustment only works when it's in these areas that are white and at the same time in these areas that are white. So the building gets rejected because it's not in the group mask, whereas the sky gets included because it's in both masks. Now when we turn this off and on, we can see we have a really nice improvement in the sky. It's getting blue throughout the sky in a nice gradual way, but it is not affecting the building. So that is why we've taken these three key steps, kind of going back to where we started at the beginning. We created a preview with a lights 3, we applied it with a curve, and now we've used a color group to further restrict that luminosity mask just to the blue parts of the image, not to all of the lights 3 parts of the image. Now, you may want to get a better feeling for how these masks work, and I'm going to show you one additional tool in the refinements here, and that is the Combine tool. Combine actually does not make any changes to the quality of your image. It's simply going to combine layer masks. So whatever group layer I'm on, if I hit Combine, it's going to take these 2 masks and merge them into an equivalent mask. And when we click on this, we can see that it's the light parts of the image just in the sky. So it's merged these 2 together. If I undo this, again, we can see we had the sky, and then we had the lights 3 preview here. But if we go and use the Combine tool, now we've put those 2 separate masks into a single mask. And this can be helpful for a few reasons. One, it's a very nice way to visualize what's going on. 2, it will reduce the size of your image. However, the downside is you can't make further changes to the individual components. In this case, it doesn't really matter because the color mask was generated by a tool and the light 3 mask was generated by a tool. So you're probably not going to refine those too much. But if one of these was a hand-painted layer, it might be a good idea to keep them as separate options. So I'm just going to leave them as they are for now. So we saw how we changed the sky there. Let's go back and just kind of quickly run through that same change again. In fact, I'm just going to delete this so we can just rapid fire move through it and make sure we get exactly what changes we made there. So we had a lights 3 preview. We applied it via a curve. We then went and made sure that curve was doing something by adjusting it. And then we clicked on the color adjustment and selected the sky parts that we wanted, not these other building parts. And now we have this adjustment that's specific to the sky in just a few steps using the preview, apply, and refine methodology. So let's take a look at another example in this building. If we zoom in a little bit closer, we're going to see it's a little bit subtle, but if you look at the image here, the lighting on this building is very uneven. On the left-hand side, it's very, very bright. In fact, these highlights are essentially blown out, whereas on the right, there's a nice balance in the building. So I want to take these highlights and tone them down a bit. So we need to find a preview that's going to be specific to these areas. And again, this is going to be another lights mask. And I'm just going to work my way down until I find something that looks very selective. Now, even with a lights 5 mask, I'm still seeing quite a bit of other areas selected. Let's look at a light 6. That's probably the mask we want to use. So let's go ahead and apply this. Previously we used a curve. Let's do something a little bit different. If you want to use a levels adjustment, you're going to notice that levels is not one of the options built into Lumenzia by default, but you can still apply a levels adjustment. And there's a couple ways to do that, and I'll show you both right now. First, we can simply just create a new levels adjustment. And of course, it's not doing anything, just a new levels adjustment here. And if we click the mask button, mask is going to take the preview and apply it as a new layer mask on whatever layer was selected. So now we have our light 6 applied to this mask. Now we don't have the Lumenzia name because we created it not by using a Lumenzia button, but by creating it in Photoshop itself. But all the same principles apply, and we can go in and start to make adjustments to our levels here, which I've overcooked it here, but you can see I brought down these values before and after. So we can just as easily create a levels adjustment with a mask as we can curves within Lumenzia. Let's go back a couple steps and I'll show you one other way if you want to work it in a different way. Let's go back here. So we've created our levels here, and instead of using the mask button, we could let's go back one more step where we didn't have the levels here. We could instead hit the selection button to load our preview as a selection. So all the marching ants show we now have an active selection. And if we create a new adjustment layer now, Photoshop will always convert a selection into a mask. So that would be another way of doing it. I generally would recommend using the mask tool when you do this. So let's go back, just because I personally like the curves, and let's just apply this as a curves, kind of like we did the first time. I really like curves, a lot of flexibility. And let's go ahead and adjust this until we get what looks like a pretty good adjustment of those areas. And probably going to keep a little bit of contrast in this. Bring this down even further. Actually, let's knock this out. So I think that looks like a pretty good adjustment for that part of the building. And again, I'm not trying for perfection here. I just want to demonstrate the principles. But looking at before where the highlights are blown out and after we've made adjustment. But of course, it's adjusting everywhere. So if we look in other parts of the building, these are being adjusted as well. So just like before, we want to restrict this to the correct parts of the building. And we can do that with a group mask and painting. And we're going to use a modifier key this time. As I hover over a group, you can see that if we hold down the Option key on a Mac or the Alt key on a PC and click on it, we're going to get a black mask. So previously we saw a white mask, which just passed everything through. In this case, we have a black mask, which knocks everything out. So we can see from the previous step, undoing here, where the adjustment was active, to afterwards we've knocked it out because the black mask has prevented anything from appearing. The reason we put a black mask here is it's very easy now to paint in the areas we want. So if the adjustment was mostly good, I might start with a white mask and then use black to hide the areas that were bad. In this case, the adjustment is kind of mostly bad, and we just want to apply it in the areas that are good, i.e. this little piece. So I'm going to hit B again to get my brush tool. I'm going to bring my flow down to something much more reasonable. And by simply painting, switching to white paint, we can see that we've made the adjustment to this part of the image, and looking before and after, we now have the adjustment isolated to just this area. So again, same principles. We use Light 6 to preview, we use Curve to apply, and then we used Group so that we could refine and isolate to this area of the mask. And just like before, let's hit Combine, and we'll see now that our mask is in fact Light 6 in just this area. And maybe I don't want to adjust this area here. So that is one benefit of looking at the combined mask. I might simply choose to switch to black paint and freehand knock that out. And now I have created this adjustment in just that area that I wanted to control there. So let's zoom out and let's make one final change here. I'm going to show you one more way you can work with the group tool. Now let's say we want to add a little bit more punch to these areas down below here. And all I need to do is really separate them from the railing that I want to leave alone, which is mostly a dark area. So in this case, selecting everything that is not dark would be a quick way of getting this. There are probably 4 or 5 different masks that would be good options here, but one is to use the opposite of a darks mask. And just like we alt-clicked on group to get an inverted mask there, we can alt-click on the dark options to get an inverted mask here. So alt-clicking on darks 3 gives us everything that's not darks 3. And we'll see it says not darks 3. If I click on darks 3 without holding any keys, we get a regular darks 3, which is the exact opposite. So these are all the dark areas. Alt-clicking this gives everything that's the opposite. So we want to be a little bit more restrictive. These areas are still too selected. So let's try not darks 4. Or in fact, let's go the other direction here. Not darks 2, or even just not darks. And I think the not darks 2 is pretty good. And it does have some selection here, but it's really a pretty mild selection. And I think for what we want to do here, it's going to be just fine. So we have a pretty good selection of these areas down below. Let's go ahead and make an adjustment. We want to apply it as a curve. Now when I hovered here, we're going to see in the tooltip, one option I have is to hold down Command to get a luminosity blend mode on the curve. And let's use that. So when I Command click on curve, you'll see that we're now in the luminosity blend mode. And that simply means when we make adjustments through the curve, it's not going to cause color shift. So I'm going to draw kind of a typical S curve that you might do to increase contrast. And we'll see before and after. We've added just a little bit more punch to these areas here, but we've done it throughout the image. So once again, we want to restrict to just this area down below. So I've shown you a couple ways of doing this before, using the color tool, where you can select by color, using the group tool, where you can sort of hand paint. I'm going to show you one other way you can work with the group tool, and that is by creating a selection before you click on group. So in this case, I'm going to go up and select the lasso marquee tool and draw a rough selection around the area that I want to change. Now you're going to see my hand drawing skills are pretty terrible. That's okay. This is going to serve as the basis of what's adjusted. So this area that's in here, when we click on group, Lumenzia recognizes that there's an active selection and it gives you a couple options. We can choose not to feather, and if we do this, it's going to turn our selection into a hard edge mask. When I say OK, we can see that the selection was turned into a mask, and when we look at it, it's a hard edge selection. Everything is either fully selected or not. It did not make any adjustments to it, it just applied it literally. Well, that's not going to be a very good mask in most cases because you're going to end up with hard edges. And in this case, because the mask was subtle enough, it's not too apparent. There's some issues if you start really looking, but it's not too bad. However, a lot of times this is not going to be an appropriate way. This will not be an appropriate way to work. So let's go back and let's do it again. So we're back with our selection here. We have the mask that we want to localize selected. We have our selection in place, and we simply hit the group button. And now this time we're going to choose to feather the mask. And what will happen is Lumenzia takes a look at the size of this selection and determines an amount to feather the selection, essentially applying like a Gaussian blur to the mask. And that'll create a nice soft transition edge. So when I say OK, we're going to once again have a selection down below. But when we look at it more closely, we can see instead of going directly from black to white, there's a nice soft transition. And the way that Lumenzia applies that, if we double click this, is through what's known as the mask feather property, something you may not be used to in your luminosity masks. But let's take a look at another one and just show you. Here is our luminosity mask we had before. If we simply apply a feather, it's effectively blurring the mask. That's just a built-in tool in Photoshop. Lumenzia is taking advantage of that on this layer here. So when it looked at the selection, it decided that 258 pixels was the appropriate blur. If we turn it all the way back to 0, we're back to our original hard edge selection. So by double clicking this, we can go in, or just simply opening the properties panel, we can adjust this. So if you don't like the feather that Lumenzia gives you, you can make it a little bit harder, a little bit softer. Whatever you want to do with it is perfectly fine. So in this case, I've made it really soft. Looks like it's going to take a minute for it to catch up. So that was probably not the best idea, but now we have a very soft transition. I'm going to go back to what Lumenzia gave us, which is in the range of 200-ish pixels. And let's click out of this. And by adding this soft transition, now when we look before and after, it is just applied to this area down below with a very smooth transition. There's no noticeable cut lines between these two areas. It just looks very, very natural. And that's the beauty of using these lasso selections with the group tool, is you can very quickly and easily isolate selections to particular parts of the image that you want to use without having to spend a lot of time brushing or getting overly fancy. And just like before, we can use the combine tool if we want to merge these together. And now we'll see our combined mask was this selected area down below with a little bit of a transition zone. So I hope you enjoyed that, and that gets you up to speed so you can go ahead and start diving into Lumenzia. I welcome any feedback on how to better improve the quick start guide. This is a new thing I've just done. But again, just to kind of recap things here, we wanted to look at how we preview a luminosity mask, then how we can turn that preview into a selection or layer mask by applying it, and then lastly, options to further refine that mask so we can isolate it to particular parts of the image. You're going to find that is a part of your workflow in Lumenzia over and over and over again. So look forward to seeing you in the next videos, and enjoy.